Conformity Experiment, 1951. Just imagine you're sitting in a room with a bunch of strangers and told it's a simple vision test. Easy peasy, right? The instructor holds up a card with one line and another card with 3 lines labeled A, B, and C. And your job is just to say which of these 3 lines matches the first one in length. Even a half-asleep sloth could ace this. You're confident about your answer. Well, that is until everyone else starts picking the obviously wrong answer. You glance at the lines again, wondering if your glasses are dirty or if it's some kind of optical illusion, or maybe everyone here graduated from clown college. But then suddenly something strange happens. Your brain is now questioning your own answer that you're sure is absolutely correct, all because everyone else is picking the wrong answer. Well, this exact situation was what happened back in 1951, when a psychologist, Solomon Asch, wanted to study conformity, the psychological tendency to follow the crowd, even when the crowd is as wrong as pineapple on pizza. And the big question in this experiment was, how much will people conform to group pressure even if it means ignoring their own eyes? He invited groups of 7 to 9 people to a room, but only one person was the real participant, while the others were just professional fakers whose mission was to simply pick the wrong answers on purpose. Well, they picked the wrong line confidently and surely, and the participant, who could clearly see the right answer, had to decide, stick with reality or blend in with the herd. Well, the result of the test showed that 37% of participants conformed to the wrong answers at least once, while 25% never conformed and stayed loyal to their eyeballs, and another 75% agreed at least once. So even if they resisted initially, peer pressure eventually got to them. Apparently, this experiment just proved that nobody likes being the odd one out, and highlighted that a lot of people actually have self-doubt, especially when everyone else confidently disagrees with you. Bystander effect. Kitty Genevie case, 1968. So, you were just walking back home from the grocery store feeling like a main character in your own personal rom-com when you suddenly heard someone yelling for help. You instinctively think of doing something to help, but then brush it off and think someone else would surely go to help. So you stand there checking your phone, pretending to text your imaginary friend while others do the same. Well, you've just entered the bizarre psychological world of the bystander effect, a situation where everyone thinks someone else will step in, but no one actually does. This psychological effect rose to fame after the tragic case of Kitty Genevie in 1964. So basically, Kitty, a 28-year-old woman in Queens, New York, was attacked outside her apartment building late one night, and when police arrived, they heard reports that at the time, at least 38 people witnessed the attack from their windows or nearby streets, but did nothing to help. Shocking, right? It was like an entire neighborhood had suddenly decided they were extras in a silent film. Now, while the exact details of the case have been debated over the years, the story captured public attention. So in 1968, psychologist John Darley and Biv Latan decided to unpack why humans can sometimes turn into bystanders instead of superheroes. They devised a clever experiment to simulate emergency situations in a controlled environment, and participants were told they were part of a study on group discussion. They sat in separate rooms and communicated via intercoms, believing they were talking to one or more people. Well, during the discussion, one participant that was actually just a pre-recorded voice pretended to have a seizure. They cried out for help, coughed, and then fell silent. Pretty dramatic stuff, like a soap opera edition. The real test was to see how quickly the actual participants would jump in to help, or if they just sit there like someone waiting for the Wi-Fi to reconnect. Sadly, the findings were eye-opening and frankly a bit disappointing for humanity. Basically, when the participants thought they were the only ones present, 85% rushed to help. When they thought one other person was present, 62% helped. But when they believed a group of 5 or more was around, only 31% helped. Turns out, the more people there are, the less likely anyone is to act. Psychologists call this phenomenon diffusion of responsibility. Basically, everyone assumes someone else will step up. It's like a potluck where everyone brings chips, assuming someone else will handle the main dish. Robbers Cave Experiment, 1954. Let's say you're at summer camp, and after a day of fun activities, you and your fellow campers decide to sit around the fire and roast marshmallows. But then, there was suddenly only one marshmallow left, and instead of just leaving it for one person, everyone starts to argue and fight over who gets to eat it. Apparently, in 1954, social psychologist Muzaffer Sharif and his team decided that they wanted to crack the code of human conflict and cooperation. So they took 22 boys to a remote summer camp in Oklahoma, and the Robbers Cave Experiment was born. Let's just say that the results were as dramatic as a reality TV show. The whole idea was to study intergroup conflict and how it could be resolved. Why do humans fight over things like land, power, or the last slice of pizza? More importantly, how can we stop fighting and work together without a referee blowing a whistle every 5 minutes? The experiment set out to test realistic conflict theory, which suggests that competition for limited resources is the root cause of conflict between groups. Essentially, if two people want the same cookie, there's bound to be a cookie crisis. So, in Phase 1, the group of boys were split into 2 groups of 11, and they each spent time bonding with their teammates. They built cabins, played games, and developed inside jokes, which was all very wholesome. But little did they know, Sharif was about to turn Camp Friendship into Camp Fight Club. Once the teams were solidified, Sharif pitted the 2 groups against each other in a series of competitive games like tug-of-war, baseball, and treasure hunts. The stakes? Prestige, bragging rights, and shiny prizes. Well, things got ugly fast. The Rattlers and Eagles turned into middle school warlords, and they burned each other's flags, raided cabins, and started calling each other names that would make a sailor blush. This wasn't just a competition, it was all-out warfare. One Eagle was so mad he threatened to use his pocket knife, because apparently summer camp in the 50s came with weaponry. And, well, Sharif's hypothesis was spot on. Competition for limited resources, in this case glory and camp swag, created intense hostility. Anyway, after the chaos reached its peak, Sharif decided to play peacemaker. The groups were given shared challenges known as superordinate goals, which they could only achieve by working together. Think of it like group therapy, but with less talking and more fixing a broken-down camp truck. The first task was to get water for the camp. Sharif intentionally sabotaged the water supply. Then next, they had to pull their money together to rent a movie. Turns out nothing brings people together like the promise of popcorn and a good flick. Slowly but surely, the hostility melted away and the boys started acting like one big dysfunctional family. So, while the experiment proved that conflict isn't just about personality clashes, it's often about competition for resources, it also showed that cooperation can bridge even the deepest divides when groups have a shared goal. Pavlov's classical conditioning, 1890s. So back in the 1890s, Pavlov wasn't actually trying to become the father of psychology. He was just a gape who really liked dogs and science. You see, the guy set out to study digestion, not behavior. Yep, his main gig was understanding how animals broke down their food, but to do this, he worked with dogs because cats were probably too sassy and birds would just fly away. But then during his experiments, Pavlov noticed something peculiar. The dogs didn't just drool when they saw food, but they also started drooling when they heard the footsteps of the lab assistant bringing the food. And this is when Pavlov had a light bulb moment, and it wasn't just about upgrading the lab flooring to drool-resistant tiles. He wondered if he could actually teach a dog to salivate when he rings a bell instead of showing food. Essentially, he wanted to see if he could pair a random sound with the promise of dinner and trick the dog's brain into thinking the bell was edible. So in the first step, he presented the dogs with food and naturally they salivated. Yep, biology at its finest. Then next, he introduced the bell, rang it, and showed the food immediately afterward. Imagine a waiter ringing a bell every time they bring you fries. Eventually, the bell becomes the MVP of the meal. Then, he just rinsed and repeated the process so much that the dogs started connecting the dots. Bell equals food. Got it! And finally, Pavlov rang the bell without showing any food, but guess what? The dogs still drooled like kids at a candy shop window. Pavlov was thrilled, the dogs were confused, and psychology as we know it was forever changed. This was basically a process he called classical conditioning. In short, Pavlov discovered that you can teach someone, or something, to respond to a stimulus they originally didn't care about just by associating it with something they do care about. You know, like how every time you hear the Netflix ta-dum, you automatically get excited for a binge session? Memory and False Memories, Loftus and Palmer, 1974. So one lazy Saturday evening, you went over to your friend's place and you guys decided to binge watch action movies. There's a wild car chase with screeching tires, epic crashes, and explosions that make Michael Bay proud. Later, when recounting the movie, your friend swears a car flipped 20 times, but you're sure it was like 3 flips tops. And when you all play the movie back, it was really just 3 flips. So now the big question is, why do our memories sometimes take artistic liberties and turn everyday events into a blockbuster? Well, that's exactly what Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer wanted to figure out in 1974. Basically, they wanted to find out how reliable our memories are, and more importantly, could the way someone asks a question change what you remember? Spoiler alert, yes. Yes, it can. Now, this experiment really focused on eyewitness testimony, which back then was treated like gospel truth in courtrooms. They wanted to find out if witnesses could be subtly influenced by the way questions were phrased. Could your brain, like a bad detective, get its facts all mixed up? And to find out, they designed an experiment that would show how memory isn't a perfect mental videotape, but it's more like a storyteller who sometimes forgets what really happened and spices things up for dramatic effect. First of all, a bunch of students were shown short clips of car accidents. After the films, the participants were asked in a paper how fast were the cars going when they blank each other. Here's the kicker. The blank wasn't always filled with the same word. Some people got hit, while others got spicier verbs like smashed, collided, bumped, or contacted. Turns out, the verb used had a huge impact on the estimated speed. Those who heard smashed thought the cars were zooming like they were late for a flight about 40.8 miles per hour, while contacted made it seem like the cars were casually catching up over coffee at like 31.8 miles per hour. But wait, there's more, because a week later, participants were asked if they remembered seeing broken glass. There wasn't any. Yet those who had heard smashed were more likely to remember shards everywhere, as if the cars were auditioning for Breaking Bad. Eventually, the experiment revealed 2 major factors. 1, the memory isn't a flawless photo album, and the way questions are worded can reshape what you think you saw. They were also able to prove that the power of suggestion and even the subtle changes in phrasing could plant false memories, turning a fender bender into a demolition derby in your mind. The Marshmallow Test, 1960s. Imagine you're 6 years old, sitting in a room that smells faintly of crayons and your teacher's coffee, and in front of you, on a small plate, sits a perfect, fluffy marshmallow. It's soft, pillowy, sugary perfection is calling to you, but there's a catch. The adult in the room says, if you wait 15 minutes without eating this marshmallow, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. First of all, telling a 6-year-old to wait 15 minutes for a sweet that's staring right at them is like asking them to wait an eternity. And then, leaving them in the room with the temptation is just plain diabolical. This was the premise of the Marshmallow Test, a psychological experiment conducted by Walter Mischel in the late 1960s and early 1970s that involved a bunch of preschool-aged children. But it wasn't just about kids and snacks. This little test was a gateway to understanding how people handle temptation and delay gratification. They basically wanted to measure self-control, a skill that plays a huge role in life. So, well, the kids were given the marshmallow, promised 2 more if they'd wait for a certain time, and then left alone. Let's just say the kids' reactions were nothing short of hilarious, and a little heartbreaking. Some sniffed the marshmallow as if they could enjoy it through osmosis. Others poked at it, probably thinking no one would notice if they just took a little bite. A few kids outright licked it, which, let's be honest, is what most adults would probably do too. Some kids caved in faster than a sandcastle in high tide. Others used every ounce of willpower they had, covering their eyes, singing songs, or even turning their back to the marshmallow like it was a toxic ex. At the end of the experiment, the result revealed a spectrum of self-control, and years later, when the researchers followed up with the same kids to see if their marshmallow patience, or lack thereof, had any long-term effects, they found out it did. The children who waited for the second marshmallow tended to have better academic success, which means maybe their patience was the secret sauce to test prep. They were also less likely to struggle with unhealthy habits and had better emotional regulation. Meanwhile, even though the marshmallow munchers weren't doomed to failure, they were more likely to face challenges with impulse control later in life. Banduras' Bobo doll experiment, 1961. You see, in the early 1960s, psychological theories were all about what people did, whether it was about rewards and punishment or biological instincts. But Bandura, a brilliant psychologist with a flair for showing that people aren't just passive sponges soaking up whatever's thrown at them, wanted to test how observational learning worked. Simply put, she wanted to know if people, especially kids, learned things just by watching others, even when they don't get rewarded or punished directly. So to answer this, Bandura and his team created a very cool and slightly mischievous experiment. They brought an inflatable Bobo doll and started punching it. And for those not familiar with Bobo dolls, just know that they were big, colorful, and bouncy plastic figures that bounced right back up when hit, making them the perfect victim for a punching contest. The experiment was divided into two groups. The first was the aggressive model group, where some of the kids were shown an adult who was totally going to town on a Bobo doll, punching it, kicking it, and even using a mallet like a cartoon villain. Then he introduced the non-aggressive model group, and this time the kids watched an adult calmly play with the doll and being gentle with the doll. Well, after the kids watched their respective models, they were all allowed to play with the toys in the same room as the Bobo doll, and just like Bandura predicted, they replicated the same action they saw the adults do. The kids in the aggressive model group started pummeling the Bobo doll too, and even adding their own flair, using things like a mallet or imitating the exact phrases the adults had used, like, "Sock 'em in the nose!" Meanwhile, the kids who saw the non-aggressive model were far more peaceful with their toys and didn't try to go near the doll with the mallet. They just played and had fun tea parties with the toys. By the end of this experiment, Bandura provided solid evidence that people, especially kids, are influenced by what they see. Bandura showed that children don't need direct rewards or punishments to learn aggressive behaviors. They can simply learn by observing others and opening up the conversation about how our actions are often influenced by what we see around us. So, in case you're wondering why your little brother is constantly walking around making fart noises and imitating your bad habits, it's totally Bandura's fault!